Good morning. My name is Daryl Singer. I practice civil and commercial litigation. Many years ago, when I started in 1993, I was a family lawyer almost exclusively for a number of years. And I did family law as a part of my practice. It ranged anywhere from 25 to about 50% of my practice, probably until about 2008. And that's when my sort of precipitous fall began. I became a narcotic addict, and I like to say I don't think it was because I was a family lawyer, but that sure as hell didn't help. When I articled in 1991, I articled at a small litigation firm in Toronto, and one of the senior associates there, who was at that time seemed very old, but I realize he was now probably 10 years younger than I am today. I'm 50. He was probably 40 or 41 at the time. And he took me under his wing. And I spent a lot of time with him, more time with him than anybody else in the firm, and he was a fantastic mentor. But one of the things I noticed was that he was almost never around for lunch. And I didn't understand that. I would often go to his office to say, I'm going downstairs to get a sandwich, let's go, or let's eat together, I want to pick your brain. And he would be gone. And after several months, I asked him about it. I said, where do you go at lunch every day? And he told me, he closed the door to his office, and he sat and he leaned in, and he spoke very quietly, and he said, I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I go to AA meetings at lunch. And he then proceeded to tell me the story about how he had risen through the ranks of that firm. And by the way, this was a very, very respected lawyer, excellent courtroom advocate, respected by judges. And he had risen through the ranks at this firm and was about to become a partner when his alcoholism got the better of him. And ultimately, they were forced to throw him out of the firm, and he spent some significant time in recovery. And when I joined the firm as an articling student, he had really just come back in, and he was starting from scratch. He was on a new marriage. He was starting over financially. He was starting over career-wise. And all I remember thinking to myself was, wow, what a loser. Did I pick the wrong mentor? Little did I know that 15 years later, I would be him. And that's why I talk about this. I do a number of these talks every year for the Law Society, other private organizations. Some of them I do with my friend Duran. This is why I'm here to talk about it. Because you can think this is not going to happen to me. You can think it only happens to other people. But I'm here to tell you that it could happen to you. And I'll tell you my story. So I've suffered from migraines since I was 10 years old. And somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this now, thankfully, much discredited theory in the medical community, which was that what we should do for chronic pain sufferers is rather than give them narcotics for breakthrough pain, we should give them the narcotics prophylactically, which means essentially they gave me OxyContin and said, you're to take this every morning when you wake up, and every day at lunchtime, and every night before you go to bed. Now, I don't need to go through, I'm not a doctor, but I know enough, and I think most of us have the common sense to understand that if you do that, your body regulates, and ultimately you need more and more and more. Now, that might have been fine if I had a nice, normal life with a normal job and a stable marriage. But now I wasn't. I was a lawyer. I practiced family law and commercial litigation in a high-stress environment. I was in a job. At one point, I went in-house in 2003. I left my position as a litigator at a 25-lawyer firm, and I went in-house with my biggest client to become vice president and general counsel. And I thought, well, this is going to be the greatest thing in the world, because no longer will I have to work nights and weekends and do trials and deal with clients and docket, except for I hated it. I realized that for all the stress and pressure, if you're a litigator, you're a litigator. And suddenly I was a guy sitting behind a desk, dealing with HR issues, dealing with compliance issues, reviewing contracts, and I was miserable. And I was having trouble at home in my marriage. And I was adjusting to some financial difficulties because when you earn the same amount of income as a T4 employee, you take home a lot less than when you earn that income as a self-employed partner in a law firm. So all of these adjustments were being made. Oh, and did I mention I had twins who were just born and I didn't sleep for 8 months? Can you guess what happened next? Anybody? Here's what happened, if you haven't figured it out. I started self-medicating with the OxyContin. Gee, I'm tired because I didn't sleep last night because of the babies. So let me take some OxyContin, that'll take me up. Gee, I can't get to bed, I'm so pumped up from my day. I'll take some OxyContin, that'll get me to sleep. I hate my job. How am I going to get through this day? Well, that's easy. I'm going to take some OxyContin at 10 o'clock, and again at noon, and again at 2, and again at 4. And before you knew it, I was a full-blown addict. The addiction got so out of control that I became careless at my job, and ultimately I was forced to resign. I was happy to resign because I hated the job, and I wanted to go back to private practice. But ultimately, I was forced to resign, and in retrospect, it was entirely because of the carelessness that I exhibited as a result of being an addict, even though I didn't believe I was an addict. And that's a very important point. Addicts lie to everybody, but mostly addicts lie to themselves. My wife at the time would say to me, "You're addicted to these drugs, you need to get help." My wife brought a friend of hers to our house who was a union rep for Ford and who had a lot of issues, a lot of experience dealing with addicts. And he said, "You need to go to Homewood. There's a bed there for 30 days. You need to go. And if you can't pay for it, we'll pay for it. But go." And I said, "Get out of my house. I'm fine." I went back to private practice, started to practice a mix of where I had left off doing family law and commercial litigation. And I thought, well, I got this shit together, man. Nobody knows. I'm showing up in court. I'm dealing with my files. I'm getting paid. Except it deteriorated and deteriorated very quickly. And although I thought I had it together, I didn't. And it got to the point that concomitant with the addiction often comes, and Duran can speak more about this from a clinical perspective, but very often a substance addiction and depression go together hand in hand. And the result was I also became severely clinically depressed. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. I think there were weeks I couldn't get out of bed. To this day, and in the course of all this, I got divorced. It was a very amicable divorce, which is another reason I don't practice family law, because I know there's a better way to do it. But I'm really surprised that my ex-wife didn't take my kids away. I'm not sure why she would send them to my house knowing the state that I was in. I couldn't take care of them. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't get out of bed. And clients, unbeknownst to me, were calling me, emailing me, going to my office, sending letters. They'd show up, my assistant would say, "I don't know where he is, I haven't seen him in 4 days. I can't reach him, he doesn't return my calls either." But I still thought I had it all together. I still thought, nobody knows. And I'm not an addict. And then I adjusted my thinking and I said, okay, I'm an addict. And Duran, you've heard this one before from other people. But I'm a functioning addict, right? Because I thought, okay, I'm an addict, but I can still function. But I wasn't. And then the letters from the Law Society started coming in, because you know what happens when you don't return your clients' calls? They start calling the Law Society. And I couldn't return the Law Society's calls either. And that's when the trouble began. And that resulted initially in me thinking maybe I had some trouble. So I went to see Duran, who at the time was running the predecessor of the Members Assistance Program, OLAP, and Duran tried to hook me up with a mentor and get me help. But Duran may not remember, that was a year before I was ready. And so I got a little bit of help, and I think I went clean for about a week, and then I relapsed. And then Duran didn't see me for another year. And in that year, everything fell apart. I lost almost all of my clients. I lost friends. I got into trouble with the Law Society because I didn't respond to them. And one of the problems is when you have these kinds of problems, and I'll talk about depression specifically because it affects far more people. One of the problems when you have a crippling addiction, a crippling depression, is that you know that you have to pick up the phone and return that call. You know it. You know, if I don't pick up that phone and call the Law Society, they're going to discipline me. If I don't pick up the phone and return that client's call, the client's going to fire me, the client's not going to pay my bill, and the client is probably going to report me to the Law Society. Intellectually, I understood I have to make this call. But this is how I describe it. My mind knew it. My mind said, arm in hand, reach to the phone and make the call. But my arm and hand didn't move. So I knew in here I had to do it, but this didn't work. This is a very common thing. Anybody that's been through any depression or lived with anybody who's been through depression knows that you don't lose your intellectual capacity to understand what has to be done. You just can't do it. And ultimately, the turning point for me, I don't know, there were a number of warning signs and turning points, but ultimately, there was one day I was checking voice messages, and it was a family law client. And many of you might be able to relate to this. And I said, now, by the way, I hadn't been suicidal. I don't think I've ever been suicidal, as severe and as deep as the depths that I was in were. But I heard that message from a family law client, and I said to myself, if I have to deal with one more family law client, I'm going to kill myself. I also realize now that I was on the road to killing myself. And I'll come back to that in a second. So ultimately at that point, somewhere around the end of 2008, I showed up at Duran's office again. And this time, I was ready. And Duran said to me, I said, what do I do? And Duran said, close your practice. Do you remember that? And I said, I didn't have much of a practice left, but I thought, Duran, I got kids, I got child support, I got bills to pay. How am I going to close what little practice I have left? How am I going to live? And Duran said, I'm paraphrasing now, but essentially the message was, you're not going to live if you don't close your practice. Recovery is a full-time job. So I did. I closed my practice for almost a year in 2009. I got help through what is now the Members Assistance Program, through various different modalities that they use. And I went to my family doctor because there was I should have gone to an inpatient program, but the waiting list was insanely long, and by that point I certainly didn't have the money to pay privately. I had a family doctor who just happened to have a subspecialty in dealing with addicts. I was very lucky. And he said, I'll help you. I will wean you off of these drugs. But you have to do every single thing that I tell you, and you're going to hate me. And this is going to be the hardest thing you will ever do. But I promise you'll come out the other side. And I did. I submitted myself to the people who were prepared to help me. And for the better part of a year, recovery was my full-time job. And I emerged in January of 2010. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, if I'm dealing with the depression and the addiction and the divorce, if that wasn't enough, I ended up getting skin cancer, and I had to have 4 operations on my head to remove that. So as they say, when it rains, it pours. But the good news is I emerged in January of 2010 clean and healthy and with a renewed outlook on life and on the practice of law. And I'm very lucky because had I not gotten the help when I did, I got clean just around the time that fentanyl was coming into vogue. And I can absolutely tell you, and I've been asked this question at a number of these seminars I've done. They said, did you get into fentanyl? And I said, I was clean before it really came out. And I've been asked a number of times, well, do you think you would have become addicted to it? And I said, there's no question, because by that point I was maxing out, just so you understand the severity of the addiction. The Toronto Star ran an article 2011 or 2012, after I was already clean, and it talked about the OxyContin and the opioid crisis, and it talked about the fact that if you take 300 milligrams a day of this drug, you could actually cause your heart to stop. And I was up to 400 and 500 milligrams a day for months and months and months and months at a time. So I don't know. If you believe in God, maybe there was somebody watching out for me, I'm not sure. I have absolutely no question, had I not gotten help when I did, fentanyl would have been the next stage. I have had, in the last 8 years, a number of friends who didn't get help for alcoholism and or drug addiction or depression, who died either as a result of an overdose or by their own hand. So I consider myself very lucky, and when people ask me why I come out and I speak to large groups like this, and my wife always says, aren't you embarrassed to stand in front of a group of lawyers, people who could refer you work and people who could respect you, and tell them this story? And I say, no, I'm not. I'm not, because if there's one person in this audience who, as a result of something I say, says, okay, there's hope. There's hope, and I'm going to seek help. And whether it's you or somebody in your family or somebody in your law firm, then I've got nothing to be embarrassed about. I've done exactly what I came here to do. So I have a number of things that I've learned as a result of what I've gone through that have given me a new outlook, but I'll save that for, I guess, the end when we do the Q&A, and I'll turn it over to my friend Duron.